Putin has only two real allies, terror and winter. We must respond to both challenges. That's how Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky characterized the primary challenges facing his nation over the coming months in an address on July 10. The footage of the Russian president hobnobbing cozily with the leaders of nations from across Asia and the Global South at Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, summit in Tianjin, China, diminishes the credibility of the first part of his statement somewhat. So do Russia's comprehensive strategic partnerships with China, India, Iran, and North Korea, and its central role in multilateral organizations like BRICS and the SCO. However, the last part of his statement, the importance of winter to Russia's military endeavors, highlights a crucial factor when waging war against Russia, as it has been for centuries. General Zima, or General Winter in English, is considered to be the primary reason for the failure of invasions of Russia by every army that's attempted it, stretching back to the 1700s. The premise is not entirely true, as we'll discover a little later. In fact, given the way the war in Ukraine has evolved, particularly over the past year, this coming winter may see the tables turned. General Winter could work against Russia, and not to its benefit, as has historically been the case. The forthcoming winter season is shaping up to be a decisive period in the war. So let's explore the role General Winter plays in the war with Russia, and how Ukraine might use it to inflict serious damage on the Russian invasion in the coming months. In Russia, General Winter is more commonly referred to as General Moroz or General Frost rather than General Winter. That's because the Russian word moroz or frost is masculine and paints a tougher picture than the feminine zima or winter. To be sure, the winter in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus is not for the faint-hearted or thinly clad. Temperatures can plummet to well below freezing, with the mercury dropping to between 14 and minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit during the 3 winters of the Russo-Ukrainian war to date. Everything is blanketed in snow and ice, with strong icy winds and regular blizzards making the simplest of outdoor chores difficult to accomplish, let alone the complex process of waging war. As a result, the Russian winter has become the graveyard for several empires. General Winter made his first appearance during the Great Northern War in the early 1700s. When Charles XII of Sweden invaded Russia in 1707, Russian troops retreated while destroying everything between them and the approaching Swedes. As winter settled in, it proved to be the coldest and most unrelenting yet. The Great Frost of 1709 was so severe that even the waters of Venice froze over, so the hapless Swedes, stranded on the steppes, didn't stand a chance. Charles XII's 35,000 troops were left stuck in the middle of a war with General Winter and the Russian army, and by the spring only 19,000 remained. Their subsequent defeat during the Battle of Poltava, now of course a Ukrainian city, ultimately sealed the fate of the Swedish Empire. A century later, Napoleon Bonaparte's Grand Armée set its sights on Moscow. In June 1812, the Russian army was forced to retreat as more than 400,000 French soldiers pressed on. The Russians adopted the same scorched earth tactics that had worked against the Swedes, burning entire villages to the ground as they retreated so that the French couldn't use them. Over 80% of Napoleon's army had been lost by the time the frosts began in October, with only 100,000 men left to make the retreat from Moscow. By November 5, food had become incredibly scarce and the army was starving. To make matters worse, the Frenchmen's winter clothing had failed to arrive, leaving the soldiers exposed to the cold in their summer uniforms. Thousands of men had died from starvation, hypothermia, and gangrene by the time Napoleon returned to France. His close advisor, Armand de Caulaincourt, summed up the horrific situation as follows. The cold was so intense that bivouacking was no longer supportable. One constantly found men who, overcome by the cold, had been forced to drop out and had fallen to the ground, too weak or too numb to stand. Once these poor wretches fell asleep, they were dead. Sleep comes inevitably, and to sleep is to die. The road was covered with their corpses. A similar fate awaited the Nazis during World War II. In June 1941, at the beginning of the summer, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, its invasion of the Soviet Union. At the start of the campaign, around 3.8 million German soldiers squared off against roughly 2.9 million Russians along a 1,800-mile front. Combined, this remains the largest commitment of forces to a single campaign in recorded history. Initially, the Germans advanced rapidly and brutally. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were captured and deliberately starved to death under the Nazi hunger plan. The plan killed two birds with one stone. Firstly, it solved the food shortages plaguing the advancing army, and secondly, it removed the Slavic population, making room for the repopulation of Russia with German civilians. But German Führer Adolf Hitler had made a fatal error. Instead of advancing into the heart of Russia, he ordered the army to take Ukraine. The campaign dragged on into the fall and then into winter. By September 1941, Kiev had been captured. But in the meantime, the Russians had reconsolidated around Moscow with 1 million soldiers and 1,000 brand new T-34 tanks. More importantly, neither Hitler nor his general staff had anticipated such a long campaign, lasting into the winter. We have only to kick in the door and the whole rot thing will come down, the Führer told them. As a result, the Germans hadn't made adequate preparations for a possible winter campaign, such as providing winter clothing and winterproofing vehicles and lubricants. As it headed for Moscow, the German blitzkrieg literally got stuck in the mud during the fall rains, more about those shortly. With winter approaching, conditions for the lightly clad German troops at the front had become grim. Weapons malfunctioned, vehicles spluttered but wouldn't start, and troops froze to death in their summer weight kit. Yet somehow Army Group Center kept advancing toward Moscow, getting within 12 miles, close enough for the lead elements to see the city's spires in the distance. Then the blizzards began. The German army decided to dig in for the winter rather than retreat suicidally. Back home, a massive collection of winter clothing was underway, which ultimately gathered a staggering 76,232,688 items in just 8 days. But it was too little too late. The much better winterproofed Soviets counterattacked the Germans, who were freezing and bogged down in heavy snow that also prevented the assistance of their air force. The Luftwaffe, by January 7, 1942, the Soviets had pushed the Germans back 155 miles from Moscow, and the Wehrmacht was retreating in a shambles. More than 400,000 men had been lost, and in many ways, General Winter had broken the back of the overall German war effort, ultimately leading to Red Army tanks rolling through Berlin in 1945. As a result of these and other episodes, the notion that General Winter ultimately makes it impossible to defeat Russia has taken root in public perception in many quarters. In Russia, this idea has been used as propaganda to galvanize popular support for Russia's various military adventures for decades. Even today, it's not uncommon to find Russian analysts and commentators invoking General Winter to talk up the prospects of an approaching Russian victory in Ukraine. But is the notion that Winter gives Russia an advantage in war true, especially in Ukraine? There are several compelling reasons to think that it isn't, and that this coming winter, General Winter might actually work against Russia, not for it. Firstly, the idea that General Winter was the primary cause of the failures of the Swedish, Napoleonic, and Nazi invasions has been debunked by prominent historians. Chief among them is Alan F. Chu, whose 1981 paper Fighting the Russians in Winter, 3 Case Studies is the most commonly cited work on the topic. According to Chu, those popular myths illustrate the uncritical acceptance and perpetuation of rationalizations designed to obscure the fact that those invincible Western military paragons were humbled by the inferior Russians. Chu argues that in all 3 cases, although the harsh winter conditions were a substantial contributing factor in the failure of the offensives, they weren't the decisive factor. Rather, it was a combination of pre-winter attrition, logistical issues, hubris, and strategic miscalculation on the part of the invaders. He notes that Napoleon's army had already suffered significant attrition before winter, owing to lack of supplies, disease, desertions, and casualties of war. At the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon could only muster around 135,000 troops, and at least 30,000 killed and wounded during the fight. Likewise, Hitler's Wehrmacht had already suffered 734,000 casualties and was running low on supplies by November 1941 before the arrival of General Winter. The winter months may have been when things finally fell apart, but the rot had set in long before that. Ukraine, on the other hand, has not made the same mistakes as Hitler and Napoleon. With the assistance of NATO partners, Ukrainian forces have, for the most part, been well equipped with winter kit and winterproofing for weapons, vehicles, and other equipment. The second reason why General Winter might not be sitting in the Russian dugout this winter is that, unlike in the examples we've discussed, in Ukraine, Russia is playing offense, not defense. Playing defense is the only other large army in the world with the same experience and expertise as General Winter as the Russians. Ukraine experiences more or less the same winter conditions and played defense as part of the Russian Empire or Soviet Union during all 3 invasions of Russia. After all, winter conditions in Russia and Ukraine have always favored the defending side. The defenders typically have more access to shelter than the aggressors, who are often forced to freeze in tents, trenches, or foxholes while the defenders sit in buildings. They also have much shorter supply lines, making it quicker and more efficient to supply and replenish frontline troops with weapons, ammunition, medicine, food, and the other supplies that so hampered the Germans, French, and Swedes. As General Winter approaches, these 2 factors, access to shelter and robust supply lines, are becoming increasingly important. Indeed, the main reason for Russia intensifying its slow summer offensive now at the end of summer appears to be a desire to establish positions within the main cities it is attacking before winter starts. These positions would be in buildings rather than trenches, ideally with basements, where Russian forces could shelter during the worst of the winter weather. However, if Ukraine manages to fend them off from Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, Seversk, Liman, Kupiansk, and Huliapli, the Russians may well be forced to fall back to settlements further in the rear. Moreover, as this war has shown, modern technology has given an increased edge to defenders rather than attackers. Ubiquitous surveillance from satellites and drones means that the era of the sneak attack is all but over. True, it was sneak Russian attacks that finally breached long-resilient Ukrainian defenses in both Avdiivka and Sudzha. However, in all three cases, the sneak attacks came through underground pipes and pipelines that the Russians fortuitously discovered and used to land troops behind Ukrainian lines. Above ground, for both sides, it's become almost impossible to assemble a significant force with which to launch a major surprise attack, let alone carry it out without being pummeled by drones, artillery, and glide bombs. That's especially true in winter, when even the limited cover provided by leaves on Ukraine's many trees disappears. With Ukraine playing defense, General Winter should work more to its favor than to Russia's. The third reason why General Winter might not be as big a factor as some seem to think is that before either side can navigate General Winter, they'll both have to conquer his equally troublesome cousin, General Mud. In many ways, if you take away the sub-zero temperatures and regular blizzards, it's actually much easier to fight during the Ukrainian winter than during spring or fall. The Russians call this time of year Rasputitsa, which translates to season of bad roads, while in Ukrainian it's known as Bezdorozhye, or roadlessness. It's easy to see where these nicknames come from. In spring, the winter ice and snow melt, turning the steppes and forest undergrowth to mud. In the fall, the snow and ice melt with the same result. Modern tanks might have much more powerful engines and improved maneuverability than their Second World War counterparts, but they also weigh tons and are just as prone to becoming stuck in the mud. The same applies to armored vehicles, towed artillery, mobile air defense systems, and even mobile drone launchers. Both sides have suffered huge losses of this equipment during the war, particularly the Russians, who are estimated to have lost over 20,000 pieces of mobile equipment already. While Ukraine's FPV drones are credited with taking out around 2/3 of Russia's 11,000 wrecked tanks, a large proportion of those were stuck in mud at the time. It's hard to get an exact picture from the limited data available publicly. But both Russian and Ukrainian equipment losses seem to be highest during the muddy seasons. During the summer months, heavy mobile weaponry can generally be moved through fields and forested areas without much resistance underfoot. Overhead is a very different story these days, with the threat of attack from FPV drones more or less baked in any time either side attempts movement. But at least the ground can be safely trodden on without sinking ankle or knee deep into it. During the muddy seasons, however, armor can only really be reliably moved on roads. But in the fall, once the mud turns into ice, it's an entirely different story again. In many areas, the snow and ice provide a solid enough base for heavier pieces like tanks to move across. There's still the ever-present threat of drones to worry about, but both sides are much less restricted in the number of off-road and on-road routes they can use. As summer turns into fall, both sides have tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of troops spread across the front lines in trenches, foxholes, bunkers, and other non-urban fortifications. The Russians must try to gain a foothold inside their main target cities before the fields turn to mud and their troops are left exposed to ever-worsening weather. The Ukrainians must try to keep them out at all costs. If the Russians gain a foothold in these cities and can consolidate supply lines into them during the mud season, the ground war in winter will probably be dominated by brutal intercity fighting. We're talking the kind of building-to-building and floor-to-floor meat grinder seen in Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Toretsk. However, if Ukraine can keep them out while General Mud is sloshing around during the fall, the war could turn decisively in their favor when General Winter makes his entrance. That brings us to the fourth and final reason why General Winter might be different this time, namely the way warfare has evolved during the course of this war. As we've already noted, Ukraine inherently has the defender's advantage in winter that comes from greater access to shelter and shorter, more easily protected supply lines and logistics. Now, it also has the weapons to press home that advantage and force Russia into a major retreat. Primarily, we're talking the array of short-range FPV drones, longer-range loitering munitions and attack drones, and the increasing range of locally made and NATO-supplied missiles at its disposal. The strategy would be to try to do to the Russians what the Soviets did to the Germans in World War II, but with high-tech equipment this time. The advanced Russian forces are, for the most part, sitting in relatively exposed positions, and at the end of very long and exposed supply lines in many parts of the front. It's their biggest vulnerability, and Ukraine can exploit it. First, Ukraine would build 10 to 20-mile kill zones around Russia's most advanced and exposed positions. Anything that tries to move in or out of these zones basically gets taken out by an FPV drone or artillery within minutes, if not seconds. Ukraine has successfully established such kill zones around the cities of Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, for example. You can see on the map how the Russian army advanced steadily to roughly 3.7 miles from these cities, then stopped, or rather was forced to stop by Ukrainian drones. At the same time, Ukraine would pummel key logistics routes leading to the front, major roads, railways, bridges, and the like. Indeed, while Ukraine has been dealing serious damage to Russia's refineries, military production facilities, and air defenses of late, There's also been a noticeable uptick in long-range attacks on Russian logistics feeding the front lines. Recent attacks on a bridge in the Bryansk region and multiple attacks on the railroad near Melitopol in occupied Kherson Oblast are just two examples. Some observers have also noted how Ukraine is more frequently hitting the same target multiple times during its nightly mass drone attacks on the Russian rear. Previously, the strategy seemed to be more about spreading targets out to extend Russian air defenses and inflicting limited damage in many diverse locations during a single raid. Perhaps it's down to increasingly sophisticated missiles and drones, or perhaps it's down to a change in strategy, but it seems as if the focus these days is on dealing more significant damage to a smaller number of targets. Since many of these are logistics targets, they would fit within the kind of overall winter strategy that would appear to be unfolding. The net result of this approach would be to isolate the advanced Russian forces, leaving them freezing, hungry, and out of ammo, beyond the reach of support. The choice would be to surrender or die. When faced with similar Ukrainian onslaughts in Kharkiv and Kherson in 2022, the Russians didn't take long to hightail it rapidly out of there. It's likely Ukraine could accomplish something similar across the front lines this winter, if it can get through the muddy season without losing control of the key cities currently being contested. It's not going to be easy. Besides freezing, not much is in the depths of General Winter's grip. But if Ukraine can successfully navigate winter, it'll be in a much stronger position when General Mud takes his bow in February or March. However it plays out, we'll of course be right on the pulse, keeping you up to date. Hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss out. Thanks for watching.